So good afternoon, Professor Mulder. Thank you very much for your time and also your willingness to share your thoughts and insight about the nuclear magnetic resonance, the methods, and intrinsically disordered protein. So you have extensive experience in this field. So we would like to ask you, what do you think that are the most significant changes that you observed over the course of your career or last couple of decades in this field?
Well, I mean, first of all, when I started with NMR, intrinsically disordered proteins weren't a thing. I mean, they didn't exist. The name itself didn't exist. And it was really the bioinformaticians who pointed out that there's a lot of work to be done if we are to understand biology in a quantitative sense, because there's lots of proteins that do not form globular structures. And so NMR spectroscopy quickly realized that it had a lot to bring to this field, because these intrinsically disordered proteins resisted crystallization, and they were hard to study by other methods. So NMR had a unique position and had real value to bring to the field. And in addition to that, I think one should never forget that NMR spectroscopy is a spectroscopy. It's not a structural method. So the fact that it has actually other things to bring to the study of proteins than the traditional structural methods. And whereas some of the structural techniques are now being threatened by AI-driven tools like AlphaFold and related tools, there is, for NMR, it's actually a great time, because there's a lot to be understood about proteins that has nothing to do with the positions of the atom in space, but a lot of the things of what the atoms do in time.
As you mentioned, when you started with NMR, the intrinsically disordered proteins were not a thing. Mm-hmm. Can you share what was the pivotal moment of the project that leads you to the NMR technique and then navigate you towards the intrinsically disordered proteins? Yeah,
so when I was a PhD student, everybody in our group was determining three-dimensional structures of proteins. That was what everybody's PhD project was. And I was actually not so attracted to this idea. It didn't seem very satisfying to me to do this. And I got much more interested in the dynamic aspect of proteins. So how do proteins move, on which time scales do they move, and how is motion a part of their function? Because as a chemist, we know that what drives processes is something called the free energy. And this free energy has two components, an enthalpy and an entropy. The enthalpy component is very strongly connected to structure, but the entropic component, which is equally important, is entirely dominated by dynamics and degrees of freedom. And this was not studied, or at least at the time it was much less studied. It was realized already very early in the discoveries of NMR spectroscopy, but the innovations that were necessary to study the dynamics of proteins were only coming around in the 90s of the previous century. And I found that a very fascinating field. And I was especially drawn to this field because I had questions about exactly these questions, like how do proteins move and on what timescales did they move, and I couldn't find the information anywhere. I couldn't find it in the books. Eventually I found, of course, some things related to molecular dynamics by simulation techniques from Martin Karplus and so on, but there were a lot of unknowns at the time, and therefore I decided to pick up protein dynamics, and I was fortunate enough that my PhD supervisors actually thought that this was a good idea and gave me actually the freedom to venture into this topic, whereas everybody else was doing structure. And then I've stayed in this area since.
And what about the IDPs?
And IDPs were something that was, funny enough, I was drawn to this topic by the presentation of an X-ray crystallographer, a very famous one called Joel Zussman. And Joel Zussman was the director of the Protein Data Bank a long time ago. And he was presenting projects that they were doing. They were crystallizing some proteins that were for which they failed. They couldn't crystallize these proteins, and it was only when they used some other techniques, spectroscopic techniques and scattering techniques, when they found out that these proteins actually didn't possess a structure. And so all their crystallization trials were completely in vain. But Joel was by no means fixed to his crystallographic method. He was very open to alternative suggestions, and he was, I guess, inspired also by Keith Dunker and other people at the time, who suggested that intrinsic disorder might be a very dominant feature of proteins, in fact. And I happened to be at a training school at the same time. I heard Joel's talk, and we started to discuss, and we decided to work on some of his intrinsically disordered proteins at the time, like neuroligin. And that's how I got started into that. Until then, I was more on protein dynamics, but then I got drawn into the IDP field. And frankly, it was a good match because there were a lot of NMR innovations that we managed to achieve as a community that have brought this field a lot further since.
You also said that you've been driven to find and look for the answers that you couldn't find in the books. So my next question is related to, what do you think that are the skills and competencies crucial for the researchers entering the field of NMR, especially the young ones?
Yeah, that's actually a little bit of a difficult question, because what has happened in the last years, maybe a few tens of years, is that people have become very much enthusiastic about integrative biology, where where the idea is that you use many techniques so you can shine light on a problem from many different angles. But there is a risk in that we lose the experts. There's a risk that we, in the end, have a lot of people who know something about everything, but nobody knows everything about something. And I would like to see that there are still young people who are enthusiastic about some techniques, and maybe some of the, an NMR spectroscopy is not an easy technique, and it can do many different things. So therefore, I would hope that there are still also young people who are enthusiastic about this and wanting to learn, now that there's still a lot of experts around who you can learn from.
Right now, it also seems to be a little bit problematic for the young ones to really have the creative thinking and maybe think a bigger picture, right? Because young ones are kind of like missing the bigger picture. So the question is, how do you encourage the innovation and creative thinking in your work with the young researchers?
Yeah, so in my experience, this idea that you only see further by standing on the shoulders of giants has always been true. So I have spent always a lot of time reading old articles from the 50s and 60s, and then coming up with innovative suggestions where maybe they're not necessarily super original, but there are a lot of ideas around that have been not feasible to explore because of lack of innovation in technology, because there were no good tools around that one can pick up. So there's a lot of things that one can do nowadays, building upon existing ideas. One doesn't have to be necessarily, as original as Archimedes. I think there's a lot of innovation that one can achieve by solid work. And in the end, a lot of innovation is more about solid work than being brilliant. So
to connect what you just said, the last question is about maybe your goals, or what do you think that the field should have as goals in the next phase, and how do you think we can achieve them?
Yeah. So there I'm actually still a little bit at the same point as I was when I was a PhD student myself, and when I saw people presenting rigid structures of protein molecules and saying, well, look at this rigid structure, this explains the function. And I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how you, from a rigid structure, can infer something about energetics. This is a lot of hand-waving. It's very speculative. And what I would like to see, and what I'm working on with my team, with young people, is trying to generate more quantitative understanding of these processes, looking at the free energy, trying to understand how can you measure free energy changes by making pressure variation to measure free energy or free volumes, to do temperature-dependent measurements to get ideas about entropy, to do compositional changes that allow you to get something about the chemical potential or the electrochemical potential. I think those kinds of physical chemistry investigations are crucial to understand things like molecular recognition in a quantitative and a predictive manner. And I think that despite all the structures that we have solved, and we're still not there, and intrinsically disordered proteins pose an additional problem because there is no single structure. So, and even if we have an ensemble of structures, then we still have to understand how this ensemble of structure actually achieves a function. So I think there's a lot of interesting work that we can still do integrating knowledge from the chemical sciences with structural sciences.
Thank you very much. Best of luck in your next endeavors, and we are looking forward to hear from you, your group, and other specialists in NMR field in the next couple of years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.